the World Conqueror. In June of 323 BC, the most powerful man alive collapsed inside a palace in Babylon. 11 days later, Alexander the Great was dead at only 32 years old. He had conquered an empire stretching from Greece to India, and no army had ever beaten him. So what actually killed him? Poison? Fever? Or something far stranger? For over 2,000 years, historians have argued about the answer, and they still do not fully agree. This is the story of the 10 strangest days in ancient history, and a mystery that still haunts medicine today. Alexander was born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of the small northern kingdom of Macedon. His father, King Philip II, had already turned Macedon into the strongest military power in Greece. As a boy, Alexander was personally tutored by the philosopher Aristotle, who shaped how he saw the world. At just 20 years old, Alexander became king after his father was assassinated at a royal wedding feast. 2 years later, in 334 BC, he crossed into Asia with an army of just 40,000 men. He defeated the Persian king Darius at Issus, then again at Gaugamela, shattering the Persian Empire. He marched into Egypt, was crowned pharaoh, and founded a city that would carry his name, Alexandria. He pushed further east than any Greek before him, all the way into what is now India. At the Hydaspes River, he fought his hardest battle yet against the Indian king Porus and his war elephants. His own soldiers, exhausted after 8 years of campaigning, finally refused to march any further east. Alexander turned back, but the retreat through the Gedrosian desert cost him thousands of lives. By 324 BC, he had reached Susa, where he staged a mass wedding between his officers and Persian noblewomen. It was a bold attempt to fuse 2 empires into one, Greek and Persian, conqueror and conquered. But behind the celebrations, cracks were already forming among generals who had followed him for over a decade. Then, in October 324 BC, tragedy struck. His closest friend, Hephaestion, fell suddenly ill with a fever in Ecbatana. Alexander was inconsolable. Ancient writers say he refused to eat for days after his friend's death. Some historians believe Alexander was never the same again, and that his grief marked the start of his own decline. In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander marched his army toward Babylon, the greatest city in the ancient world. Babylon was almost mythical in size, a city of canals, hanging gardens, and the tallest ziggurat on earth. Alexander planned to make it the new capital of his empire, a bridge between Europe and Asia. But as his army approached the city gates, Babylonian priests came out to warn him not to enter. They said the stars themselves had turned against him. Alexander laughed it off and rode in anyway. Homecoming to Babylon. Alexander entered Babylon in triumph, and delegations from across the known world arrived to pay homage. Ambassadors came from Carthage, from Italy, and even from tribes at the far edges of the known world. At the height of his power, Alexander was already planning his next campaign, an invasion of Arabia. He ordered a new fleet built and sent scouts to survey the marshlands along the Euphrates. Those marshes, thick with reeds and standing water, bred swarms of mosquitoes, a detail no one thought important at the time. But Alexander himself was growing strange with worry. Ancient writers say he had become unusually superstitious in his final weeks. One day, a stranger walked into the throne room, calmly sat on Alexander's empty throne, and put on his royal robe. The Chaldean priests declared it a terrible omen. Alexander had the man questioned, but he gave no explanation. Then came stranger signs still. A wild lion confronted a tame donkey inside the palace grounds. Flocks of ravens were seen fighting each other above the city walls, some dropping dead at Alexander's feet. Centuries later, this strange detail would become a clue in one of the most surprising theories about his death. At the time, Alexander tried to shrug off the omens and threw himself back into work and celebration. He worked almost without rest, planning campaigns by day and holding long feasts late into the night. His inner circle noticed he seemed thinner, more tired, and quicker to anger than the man they remembered. Still, nothing suggested the end was near. Alexander had survived wounds that should have killed most men. Then, in late May of 323 BC, he attended a banquet that would change everything. The Shadow of Hephaestion. Hephaestion's death left a wound that never fully healed. Alexander ordered mourning across the entire empire. He commissioned a funeral monument said to cost more than 10,000 talents, one of the most expensive ever built. He even wrote to the oracle at Siwa, asking that Hephaestion be honored as a god. He cut his hair short in the old Homeric style of mourning, an act reserved for the deepest losses. For a time, he banned music and festivities throughout the camp, an unusually severe response to grief. Some ancient writers claim he began drinking more heavily in the months that followed, trying to dull the pain. Modern doctors studying the ancient sources wonder whether grief, exhaustion, and alcohol together weakened him more than anyone realized. It's a question historians still can't fully answer. Did a broken heart help set the stage for what came next? Whatever the cause, by the time Alexander reached Babylon, those closest to him said he was not quite himself. He pushed forward anyway, determined to finish his plans for Babylon and the campaign into Arabia. On the surface, everything looked the same. The feasts, the ceremonies, the endless stream of visitors and envoys. But those who knew him best sensed something had shifted since Hephaestion's death, a weight he never set down. Then, on an ordinary evening in late May, Alexander's old friend Medius invited him to one more banquet. It seemed like any other night of Macedonian hospitality. No one imagined it would be his last. The Banquet of Medius. The banquet was hosted by an officer named Medius in one of the grand rooms of Nebuchadnezzar's old palace. Wine flowed freely, as it always did at Macedonian feasts. Alexander was known to drink deeply, sometimes for hours. According to several ancient accounts, Alexander drained a huge cup of wine, known as the Cup of Heracles, twice in a row. Some later writers claimed the second cup was where a poison was hidden, delivered by his own cupbearer. Other sources insist nothing suspicious happened at all, that Alexander simply drank, laughed, and stayed until nearly dawn. What we do know is this. Sometime that night or the next morning, Alexander suddenly cried out in sharp pain. The historian Plutarch wrote that the pain struck him, in his words, as if pierced by a spear. He was helped from the table and taken to rest, still expected to recover after a night of excess. The royal physicians were not alarmed at first. Fevers after heavy feasting were common enough in the ancient world, but by the next morning, the fever had not broken. Alexander remained in bed, unusually weak. The royal journals, kept by scribes who recorded the king's daily activities, began noting his condition day by day. Historians today still rely on fragments of those journals, preserved through later Greek and Roman writers, to reconstruct what happened next. It is one of the most detailed medical case histories to survive from the entire ancient world. Day by day, for the next week and a half, we can follow Alexander's decline, almost as if watching it happen. It begins with fever. It ends with silence. This is the day-by-day account, as ancient sources and modern doctors have pieced it together. The Royal Diaries, Days of the Fever. Day 1. Alexander woke with a fever. He bathed as usual, performed his morning sacrifices, and rested on a couch. Despite the fever, he played dice that evening with his officer Medius, refusing to break his usual routine. That night, the fever did not break. He bathed again before bed, hoping it would ease the heat in his body. Day 2. He bathed again, performed the required sacrifices, and had himself moved to the cooler bathroom to escape the heat. Still he kept working. He summoned his Admiral Nearchus and asked to hear in detail about his voyage down the Persian Gulf. It's a striking detail. Even seriously ill, Alexander's mind was still fixed on ships, coastlines, and the campaign ahead. Day 3. The pattern repeated: bathing, sacrifice, rest in the cool bathroom, and orders given for the coming expedition. But those close to him began to notice the fever was not behaving like an ordinary illness. It simply would not lift. Day 4. The fever grew worse. Yet Alexander still gave orders for his officers to prepare for the march and the fleet's departure. His wife Roxana, pregnant with his only child, stayed close by his side as the days wore on. Day 5. Alexander bathed morning and night as always, but his condition had clearly taken a serious turn. He called his senior commanders together and gave firm orders. The infantry would leave in 2 days, the fleet in 3. It was, in hindsight, an oddly precise set of orders from a man who had no idea he was dying. Or perhaps he did know, and was determined to keep the empire moving for as long as his strength allowed. Day 6. The fever turned violent. He asked to be carried near the water, seeking any relief from the burning heat. He was still lucid enough to discuss filling vacant military posts, a sign his mind remained sharp, even as his body failed. By now, word had spread through the camp. Soldiers gathered outside the palace walls, anxious for any news of their king. The physicians, meanwhile, were running out of explanations. Nothing in their training seemed to match what they were seeing. Modern doctors, looking at these same symptoms 23 centuries later, still argue fiercely about what disease could explain them. A high, unrelenting fever, abdominal pain, days of decline without clear improvement. The clues were there, but the answer was not obvious. And the illness was only getting started. What came next would take away the one thing every king relies on: his voice. This is where the ancient sources and the historians who study them begin to genuinely disagree with one another. The silence falls. Day 7. The fever surged again. This time, Alexander could no longer rise from his bed at all. The physicians tried every remedy they knew: herbal drafts, cooling baths, and prayers offered to multiple gods at once. Nothing worked. Whatever was moving through his body was stronger than anything ancient medicine could counter. By day 8 or 9, according to most accounts, Alexander lost the ability to speak. He could still recognize the men around him and weakly move his eyes and his hand, but his voice was gone. Word spread through the army that their king could no longer speak. Panic began to ripple through the camp. The soldiers demanded to see him with their own eyes. They no longer trusted rumors passed through the palace gates. The generals, fearing a riot, finally agreed. The army would be allowed to file past their dying king, one by one. They came unarmed, stripped of their weapons out of respect, filing silently through the long chamber where Alexander lay. One by one, thousands of men who had marched across the known world walked past his bed for the last time. Ancient sources say Alexander could not speak, but he raised his hand slightly, or moved his eyes, to acknowledge each one. It must have been an extraordinary scene. The conqueror of the known world, silent, while his own soldiers wept walking past. With Alexander unable to speak, his generals grew desperate for answers about who would rule if he did not recover. According to one famous tradition, someone finally leaned close and asked him directly, "To whom do you leave your kingdom?" The answer, some ancient writers claim, was a single word, barely audible: "To the strongest."
The phrasing here is crucial.
Other historians believe this famous line was invented after his death to justify the chaos that was about to follow. What is certain is that Alexander never named a single clear heir, and by this point, he likely could not have. The most powerful empire on earth was about to be left with no obvious successor and a king who could no longer speak. To the strongest. On the 10th of June, 323 BC, some of Alexander's officers slipped out of the palace toward the temple of Serapis. They asked the priests one final question: should the king be carried into the temple to be healed by the god himself? The priest's answer, according to the sources, was chilling. it would be better for Alexander to remain where he was. That night, back in the palace, Alexander's breathing grew shallow. Roxana and his closest companions stayed at his bedside. Sometime in the evening hours of June 10th, or perhaps just after midnight on the 11th, Alexander the Great died. He was 32 years old. He had ruled for 13 years and never lost a single battle. Outside, the city of Babylon had no idea yet. For several days, the palace kept the news deliberately quiet. Historians believe the generals were too afraid of what would happen the moment the truth got out. When the announcement finally came, grief swept through the army, followed almost immediately by fear and confusion. Roxana, pregnant with Alexander's only child, was now a widow in a palace suddenly full of rival ambitions. Alexander's generals, the men who had fought beside him for over a decade, now eyed each other as rivals instead of brothers. Perdiccas, who held the king's signet ring at the moment of death, stepped forward to try to hold the empire together. But the truth was simple and brutal. Alexander had built an empire around himself, and only himself. Without him, it had no center. And there was one more mystery still to come. Something about Alexander's body itself that would puzzle historians for centuries. The body that would not rot. In the days after his death, something strange was noted by those preparing his body. It showed no signs of decay. This was in Babylon in June, one of the hottest months of the year. Bodies decomposed quickly in that climate, and everyone knew it. Yet 6 days passed, and Alexander's body remained, in the words of ancient writers, as fresh as if he were merely sleeping. To the people of the ancient world, this was proof of something divine. Surely, they said, this was no ordinary man. The Egyptian embalmers who had been sent for finally arrived and began the long process of preparing the body for its final journey. For centuries, this detail was treated as pure legend, a flourish added to make a great king's death feel even more extraordinary. But in recent years, a modern doctor looked at this ancient detail and asked a chilling question. What if Alexander's body did not decay for 6 days? Because he was not actually dead yet. It is one of the most unsettling theories in this entire mystery, and we'll return to it in detail later in this video. For now, what matters is this. Alexander's death sent shockwaves through an empire that had never planned for a world without him. He had no clear heir, no named successor, and an army of battle-hardened generals, each convinced he deserved to rule. Before we explore the leading theories about what killed him, let's look at what happened to the empire he left behind. Theory 1. Poison. The first and most dramatic theory is also the oldest, that Alexander the Great was murdered. The story goes like this. The mastermind was Antipater, the aging regent Alexander had left in charge of Macedonia for over a decade. Antipater had reason to fear Alexander. The king had grown suspicious of his governors and had already removed several for corruption or disloyalty. Shortly before his death, Alexander had summoned Antipater to Babylon, a command that terrified the old regent. According to the theory, Antipater's son Cassander came to Babylon instead, carrying a poison said to dissolve metal itself. Legend claimed the poison came from the river Styx itself, so corrosive that only the hoof of a mule could hold it safely. The poison, the story goes, was passed to Alexander's cupbearer Iolaus, who slipped it into his wine at the Banquet of Medius. Even ancient historians who repeated this story admitted they weren't sure it was true. Plutarch himself called it controversial. So why do modern historians remain skeptical of the poison theory, despite how dramatic and satisfying it sounds? The biggest problem is timing. Alexander's illness lasted nearly 12 days. Almost no poison, known in the ancient world, acted that slowly. Fast-acting poisons like hemlock or strychnine-based compounds tend to kill within hours, not days. This illness moved far too slowly to match. There is also a political problem with the story. It surfaced mainly years after Alexander's death, during a bitter propaganda war between rival generals. Cassander, the alleged poisoner, eventually became king of Macedonia. His enemies had every reason to paint him as a murderer. In fact, decades later, it's said that Cassander's own family tried to have the accusation erased from public memory. That doesn't prove Cassander was innocent, but it does mean the poison story may say more about Macedonian politics than about medicine. Even the ancient sources most sympathetic to the poison theory, like the later writer Curtius, admit the evidence was always circumstantial. Most historians today believe poison is possible but unproven, and probably less likely than a natural illness. Still, the theory endures because it fits a very human instinct. It's hard to accept that the man who conquered the world could be undone by a mosquito. A murder feels like it means something. A fever just feels cruel and random. So let's turn to the theory most modern doctors actually consider the most likely culprit: infectious disease. Theory 2, fever in the marshes. In 1998, a team of doctors at the University of Maryland held an unusual conference, a modern medical diagnosis of a patient who died in 323 BC. Their conclusion pointed to one of the oldest killers in human history: typhoid fever. Typhoid is caused by bacteria spread through contaminated food and water, extremely common in densely populated ancient cities. Its symptoms match Alexander's case with unsettling precision: a slow climbing fever, abdominal pain, and a gradual, days-long decline. Babylon, remember, sat on a network of canals and irrigation channels, exactly the kind of water system where typhoid bacteria could easily spread. Alexander himself had recently been exploring those very marshlands, planning his fleet in the weeks before he fell ill. If typhoid was the culprit, then the very expansion project he was so excited about may have carried the seeds of his death. The other leading natural explanation is malaria, spread by mosquitoes that thrived in those same wetlands around the Euphrates. Malaria was common across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, and skeletal and historical evidence confirms it plagued Mesopotamia for centuries. Severe malaria can cause exactly the kind of relentless fever, exhaustion, and organ strain that the royal journals describe. Some experts argue Alexander's fever pattern doesn't perfectly match classic malaria, which often rises and falls in a distinctive rhythm. But severe, complicated cases of malaria can also produce a continuous, unrelenting fever, just like the one described in the ancient sources. Both diseases were endemic to the region. Both match major parts of the symptom list, and both were completely invisible to ancient physicians. Remember, the concept of bacteria and parasites wouldn't exist for another 2,000 years after Alexander's death. His doctors weren't incompetent. They were working entirely blind, treating symptoms with no concept of the invisible cause behind them. For many modern historians, typhoid or malaria remain the simplest, most statistically probable explanation. Alexander likely died of a common ancient disease. Not poison, not a curse, just bacteria or parasites doing what they had already done to countless people before him. But two more theories remain, and one of them involves a detail we mentioned earlier: the strange death of the ravens. Theory 3, the raven omen. In 2003, two American researchers published an unusual paper in a medical journal connecting Alexander's death to a very modern outbreak. In 1999, New York City experienced its first outbreak of West Nile virus, a mosquito-borne disease new to the Americas. Before the first human cases appeared, one strange thing happened. Crows and other birds began dying in unusually large numbers. The researchers remembered an old detail from the ancient sources. ravens dying and falling from the sky above Babylon just before Alexander fell ill. Could those ancient ravens have been an early warning sign of the very same virus more than 2,000 years earlier? West Nile virus is spread by mosquitoes, exactly the kind that thrived in the marshlands surrounding Babylon's canals. In severe cases, the virus can cause encephalitis, inflammation of the brain, leading to fever, weakness, and even paralysis. That would help explain both the high fever and possibly the paralysis and loss of speech in Alexander's final days. It's a genuinely clever theory, connecting an ancient omen to a disease that wouldn't be scientifically identified until the 20th century. But most historians remain cautious. A single anecdotal detail about birds is a thin thread to hang an entire diagnosis on. Ancient writers loved omens. Ravens, lions, strangers on thrones. These details may simply reflect a storytelling tradition, not literal medical evidence. Still, the West Nile theory remains one of the most cited alternative explanations in modern medical literature about Alexander's death. It's a reminder that history and epidemiology sometimes intersect in the strangest, most unexpected ways. But the strangest theory of all doesn't concern what killed Alexander. It concerns whether he was even dead when they thought he was. Theory 4. Buried alive. In January 2019, Dr. Catherine Hall, a clinician at the University of Otago in New Zealand, published a genuinely unsettling new theory. Her theory centers on a real, still existing condition called Guillain-Barre syndrome, an autoimmune disorder that can follow a common infection. In Guillain-Barre syndrome, the body's immune system mistakenly attacks its own nerves, causing paralysis that spreads slowly upward from the feet. In severe cases, that paralysis can reach the muscles used for breathing, while the patient remains fully conscious the entire time. Hall noticed the ancient symptoms matched this pattern closely: a preceding infection, progressive paralysis, loss of speech, but likely a clear mind throughout. And then there was that other detail. Alexander's body reportedly did not decompose for 6 full days in the Babylonian heat. Ancient physicians had no modern tools to confirm death, no way to measure brain activity, and only the crudest sense of pulse and breath. Hall's theory raises an extraordinary and deeply uncomfortable possibility. What if Alexander wasn't dead when everyone believed he was? What if his true death came days later than history recorded, while his body simply appeared lifeless from total paralysis? It's important to say clearly, this is a hypothesis, not a proven fact. Many historians and doctors remain skeptical. But it's a hypothesis built on real, documented medical science, not myth or legend, and that's what makes it so hard to dismiss outright. If true, it would mean Alexander's last days were even more harrowing than the ancient sources ever described. Aware, but unable to move. Surrounded by people mourning him, while somewhere inside, he may still have been present. It's a sobering thought, and a powerful reminder of how much medicine has changed in 23 centuries. Today, doctors have precise tools to detect even the faintest signs of life, tools no ancient physician could have imagined. Whether or not Hall's theory is correct, it has forced historians to reconsider the very end of Alexander's story with fresh eyes. An empire torn apart. In the chaos after Alexander's death, his generals scrambled to fill the void he left behind. The infantry wanted Alexander's half-brother, Aridaeus, crowned king immediately, even though he was widely seen as unfit to rule alone. The cavalry officers argued for patience. Alexander's wife Roxana was pregnant, and her child, if a son, had a stronger claim. Eventually, a fragile compromise was reached. 2 kings would rule jointly, Aridaeus and Roxana's future child, whoever that might be. Roxana soon gave birth to a son. He was named Alexander IV, a king before he could even speak. Perdiccas, who had received Alexander's ring, took on the role of regent, trying to govern in the names of two kings who could not rule. It didn't take long for the alliance to fracture. Old rivalries between the generals hardened into open conflict. One of the very first flashpoints was almost unbelievable, an argument over where Alexander's own body should be buried. Alexander had reportedly wished to be buried at the Oracle of Siwa, or perhaps in Macedonia, beside his ancestors. But as the funeral procession moved west, Ptolemy intercepted it and diverted Alexander's body to Egypt instead. It was a bold and calculated move. Whoever controlled Alexander's body controlled a powerful symbol of legitimacy. Ptolemy eventually settled the body in Alexandria, the city Alexander himself had founded, where it would remain for centuries as a legendary tomb. Meanwhile, the wars over Alexander's empire had only just begun. Historians call this brutal era the Wars of the Successors. Perdiccas was killed by his own officers within just 2 years of taking power. Roxana and her young son, Alexander IV, were eventually killed as well, victims of the very ambition that had consumed the empire. Within about 20 years, Alexander's single vast empire had splintered into several rival kingdoms, each ruled by a former general. Ptolemy's line would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, ending only with the death of a queen named Cleopatra. In the end, Alexander conquered more territory than any man before him, and still could not conquer the one thing that came after: his own succession. What science believes today. So, after 23 centuries of debate, what do most modern doctors and historians actually believe killed Alexander the Great? The leading consensus points toward a severe infectious disease, most likely typhoid fever, possibly complicated by other factors. Years of heavy drinking, old battle wounds, exhaustion, and profound grief may have already weakened his body before the fever even began. In other words, it likely wasn't one single cause, but a body already pushed to its absolute limit, finally overwhelmed. The poison theory remains historically fascinating, but most evidence suggests it was largely political storytelling after the fact. The West Nile theory offers a clever, if speculative, connection between an ancient omen and a very real modern disease. And the Guillain-Barre, pseudo-thanatos theory, raises the most haunting question of all. Not what killed him, but exactly when. The frustrating truth is this: without Alexander's actual remains to examine, certainty may simply be impossible. His original tomb in Alexandria was lost sometime in late antiquity, and its exact location remains one of archaeology's enduring unsolved mysteries. Without DNA, without bones, without a body, historians are left working entirely from fragments of text written decades or centuries after the fact. It's a humbling reminder that even the most famous death in ancient history remains, in the end, an open case file. Modern science has solved mysteries far older than this one, but some questions may simply outlive the evidence needed to answer them. What we do know for certain is simpler, and in some ways, more important than the cause of his death. We know exactly what he built, what he destroyed, and what the world looked like in the vacuum he left behind. Legacy of a Ghost King. Alexander's empire did not survive him, but his impact on the world absolutely did. For centuries afterward, Greek language, art, and ideas spread from Egypt to India, an era historians now call the Hellenistic period. The city he founded in Egypt, Alexandria, became the greatest center of learning in the ancient world for centuries to come. Generals like Ptolemy built dynasties that lasted for generations, shaping the Mediterranean and the Near East long after Alexander himself was gone. Rulers for centuries afterward, from Roman generals to medieval kings, looked back at Alexander as the ultimate measure of ambition. All of it: the empire, the legend, the influence that outlasted him by centuries, came from a life that ended in 11 strange days. At 32 years old, In barely more than a decade of campaigning, Alexander reshaped more of the world than most rulers manage in a lifetime twice as long, and yet in the end, even he could not outrun fever, fate, or the simple limits of the human body. So, what do you think really killed Alexander the Great? Poison, disease, or something medicine is still catching up to understand? Let us know your theory in the comments below, and subscribe to Clue Series for more of history's greatest unsolved mysteries.